and on your smart speaker. TalkSPORT.
TalkSPORT News.
Still to come today, we'll be over in Saudi talking to Spencer Oliver. We've got the big Queensbury Matchroom 5v5, some big fights on the card. Spencer will be telling us more about that later on. Spurs in the 90s next, a new book on the subject. But first, Sinead Garvin with the news headlines.
Thanks, well, good afternoon. Labour says it won't match the Tories' proposal for a tax cut for pensioners if they win in July's general election. The Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has been setting out Labour's economic policy.
I want taxes to be lower, but unlike the Conservatives, I won't make unfunded commitments, because the truth about unfunded commitments is that no one can have any confidence that you can deliver on them.
Elsewhere, Nigel Farage has been speaking as well. Though he's not standing, he is campaigning for Reform UK and claims a Tory vote is a wasted one. Meanwhile, the Lib Dem leader sort of fell or maybe even jumped into the water to make a splash while he was campaigning on Lake Windermere. Elsewhere today, several Israeli tanks have reportedly reached the centre of Rafah as its military operation goes on. It's as a top UN official says the Gazan city has been turned into hell on earth after people were burnt to death in an Israeli airstrike that killed at least 45. And dozens of detectives are going to investigate the bosses involved in the Horizon IT scandal. The Met Police are leading an investigation into possible offences by senior leaders at the Post Office and Fujitsu, but must wait until the public inquiry is complete.
Talk Sport with Bostik. If you need a professional grade sealant with high mould resistance, easy tooling and minimal shrinkage, choose Bostik Pro Sealants.
Simon Jordan believes Chelsea is in a much better position than Man United for a new young manager, and Jack Catterall has had his say on Bob Arum's antics after his controversially scored victory over Josh Taylor. More with Will at 3.
TalkSPORT Drive. This afternoon from 4 on TalkSPORT.
TalkSPORT Drive with me, Darren Bent.
And me, Andy Goldstein.
Sports radio that's guaranteed to go the distance.
Move up through the gears with all the day's sports.
Daily football debates, plus a bootload of banter.
Watch the lights, release the clutch, drive!
TalkSPORT Drive with Andy Goldstein and Darren Bent.
This afternoon from 4 on TalkSPORT.
The fastest football on the way home.
That's going to come back to haunt me, that one, isn't it?
Yes, we're going to take you back to a decade now.
Oh, yeah.
When Spurs topped and tailed with trophies.
Oh, yeah.
It's been a while since we've done that. An FA Cup and a League Cup at the end of the 90s. Gareth Dace has written, is Gascoigne going to have a crack? Telling the story of Spurs in the 90s. Good afternoon, Gareth.
Hello, afternoon, Paul. Hi, Charlie.
What was it about this particular era of Tottenham as a fan that sort of enticed you to write a book about it?
Well, on a very personal level, these were my formative years. So I started the 90s as a 9-year-old, so at primary school, and it was my first taste of football and of Tottenham. So it's what I grew up with. So the book charts some of my own personal experiences going from primary school through to secondary school and then leaving school and going to work. And of course, it was a decade, as you just mentioned there, where you live in a big area, Spurs Arsenal area.
Oh yeah,
it wasn't very nice going to school on a Monday morning very often during the 90s.
Well, because the sort of subhead on your book is Magic, Mayhem and Mediocrity, and I wondered, like, percentage-wise, what you would...
Which one is which?
70% mediocrity, 10% magic? I don't know. I mean, there were some notable things that the cover... Is Gascoigne going to have a crack? Is Barry Davis's line from the FA Cup semi-final in 1991 where they beat Arsenal and went on to win the final against Forest. There's a picture of Alan Sugar on there. There's David Ginola, some of the positive highlights, and Jurgen Klinsmann and that dive when he scored against Sheffield Wednesday when he first came in. So they're they were, well, some of it depends how you view the Alan Sugar years, but they were some of the positives, weren't they? I guess
there was. I think when I first started writing it was that this was a decade of mediocrity. But the more that I remembered back about what happened and some of the players and incidents you've just spoken about there, there was those moments of magic, and even that's Klinsmann season that we'll call the 94-95 season where we didn't win anything at the end of it, but so many players and fans who remember that time will say that was just the most enjoyable season they had following Spurs, regardless of the end outcome for it. So there was a lot of fun to be had in there. But yeah, I think it probably was that even mix of magic, mayhem and mediocrity. And I'm holding the book up here. On the back of it there, I mean, you can see TalkSPORT's own Jason Cundy there in the shirt that I'm wearing there.
Yeah.
Now, whether that was magic, mayhem or mediocrity, the goal he scored against Ipswich, I think he talks about it every now and then, doesn't he?
I think he gives it a mention now and again, more or less from the halfway line. He sort of hoofed it into the net. If you haven't seen it online, I'm sure you have. It's worth checking.
I suppose you're in the era of your pre-Premier League and post-Premier League as well. What are the main differences you find in the book?
Yeah, that's right.
90s, I think it's such a transformative decade, not just for Spurs, but for English football in general. So you said the Premier League came into formation in 1992. But even in those early years of the Premier League, it's not the slick product that it is now. So uncovering, I guess, just some of the naivety of football as we remember it from younger years. I mean, the state of the training ground, for instance, is one thing that Spurs were using. I mean, you possibly remember it, Paul. They were hiring a public field over in Mill Hill until they moved into Chigwell. So there's lots of things like that go on. So I mean, hopefully the book will be interesting not just for Spurs fans. I mean, obviously that's the primary audience there, but hopefully for any fans who remember that area and want to remember the way that football transformed from the start of the decade, where coming out of the 80s and some of the horrible things that happened there, through to what we now know is this really slick product that the Premier League become.
I think perversely Arsenal fans would love it.
Yeah. I'll just have the mediocre.
You'd love reading it just chapters. For the Schadenfreude. It was a player we probably should have signed. But yeah, I mean, it's there were some...
They often say men can just sit around and name old footballers, and that's sort of their favourite thing to do. Name me some old footballers who people might have forgotten from Spurs mid-90s.
Okay, let's go.
I'm thinking David Howells.
David Howe's contributed to the book. Yeah, David Howe's part of the 91 FA Cup winning team. But let's go with Kevin Scott.
Oh, okay.
Kevin Scott, yeah.
Jason Desailly.
Oh, yeah, Jason Desailly.
Didn't particularly work out well for Jason as a Tottenham player, did it?
Who was the manager you had? The little guy, was he Norwegian manager you had? Who were your managers in the 90s?
So we start with the late great Terry Venables.
Of course,
and then he left fairly acrimoniously, and the book charts that episode. Ozzy Ardiles came in for a little while, and we had the great fun of the front five, and then Jerry Francis, who also was very grateful with his time. I spoke to Jerry as well, and then Christian Gross is probably
Christian Gross, that's what I was after.
with his tube ticket. I got here on the tube.
That's what I remember.
That's right. It's his badge of honour, and that didn't go massively well.
It didn't go massively well. And then George Graham came in, and I know you had your own take on that, didn't you?
Yeah, well, that's right. George, of course, fans singing when they won the League Cup against Leicester, "Man in the Raincoat's Blue and White Army," because they couldn't even bring themselves to say his name because he'd been the Arsenal manager.
Do you feel that Spurs had more of an identity, more of a personality then than they do now?
I think they probably lost their identity as the decade went on. I mean, at the start of the decade, the Terry Venables team with Gascoigne and Lineker that won the FA Cup, it was a fairly fragile team, but of course they were out to pull out those really, really big results, and they did it with mercurial talents, which I guess probably is part of the club's DNA, really, isn't it?
They've always signed players like that, Ginola and Klinsmann and players like that. I mean, when you consider Klinsmann came in, lasted a season, then we had the infamous Alan Sugar saying, feeling let down when he left, and threw the shirt the journalist and said, "You can have it, I wouldn't wash my car with that." And then, of course, he has to come back a couple of seasons later in a kind of mercy dash to keep Tottenham up.
Yeah, that's
because they could have gone down in the middle of the 90s.
That's it. I mean, I think that's an important thing to point out, that I know as a fan base we can be quite neurotic at times, can't we? And people get upset if we're sort of only in 6th or 7th place. But I mean, during the 90s, there were two very, very real relegation scares. Yeah. So the second of them, Klinsmann came back and scored 4 at Wimbledon to keep us up at the end of the season. But bobbing around sort of mid-table was what we were as a club throughout much of the 90s, with the occasional superstar coming in. And
so it's not all gravy and tourists buying up the seats and £7 a pint, Daniel. We were there thick and thin, mainly thin.
Thin and thin.
Well, let's hope the club remember that. So, I mean, what sort of reaction have you had from people? I mean, are people sort of misty-eyed about the 90s? I suppose they're looking for the positives amongst some of the dross, aren't they?
I think so. Many Spurs supporters who I've spoken to, and I think you were one of them, Paul. When I first mentioned you, I'm writing this book about the 90s. I guess as someone who saw Spurs winning lots of trophies in the 80s, your immediate action was to roll your eyes and say, "Oh, the 90s," and that's exactly what.
I can immediately think of anything positive to say until I really thought about it. Yeah.
Our mutual friend Pete Abbott said much the same. Julie Welsh, who wrote the foreword for the book as well. That was all there. That was always their starting point for it. But I mean, certainly Julie, in writing the foreword and having looked through it, I think was perhaps slightly more misty-eyed at the end of it than she was at the at the start of it.
There were good. There's always good moments. If it was complete dross, you'd never go, would you?
Exactly.
There's always great moments and great games and great goals and great memories from any era for any team. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what division. I mean, I could ask you about Torquay in the 90s.
I tell you. Do you want to know some high points? Beating Spurs in 1987 in the Littlewoods Cup at home.
Not on aggregate.
Not on aggregate, but we'll take it though. You know.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember the Torquay fans singing, "We're Torquay United FC. We're by far the greatest team the world has ever seen."
We are.
Not sure.
We are.
I was trying to find a Torquay
angle. Are you
angle.
Barnet in disguise? Yeah. We used to see it at Tottenham when we were beating them.
Yeah. No, I was trying to find a Torquay angle in preparation for it. The only one I could find is that Lee Sharp scored against us for Man United once.
Well, I mentioned David House because Gareth House was our our goalkeeper.
Played in Going when they won the playoff final.
When we beat Blackpool in the playoff final.
I was there that day, Charlie.
He scored the winning penalty.
You can still see Dave Bamber walking up to take the penalty, knowing he was going to miss.
Gareth's in Torquay folklore.
What about that?
But this is about Spurs, this interview, not Torquay.
It is. Well, look, Gareth, all the best with the book. It's available now. It's published by Pitch. It's called Is Gascoigne Going to Have a Crack? Reliving Tottenham in the 90s.
Sounds great. Sounds really good.
We wish you well with it.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
Gareth Dace there. So, still to come, we're going to talk a bit of cricket. Sam Ellard's going to join us. Hopefully, we're going to see some cricket. We've had one of the T20s ruled out because of the weather. It's not looking great in Cardiff. If we're going to see any play, we'll ask Sam about that and look at some of the stories, hopefully, if we do. Spencer Oliver joins us for a bit of a boxing chat later on. Lots more besides, all still to come. We're here with our good friends at Tool Station for a job done right.